The air around Gettysburg in May 1864 didn't smell of glory. It smelled of scorched earth, sweat-lathered horseflesh, and the ozone of a gathering storm. For 3 years, James Ewell Brown, Jeb Stuart, had been the phantom of the Virginia woods, a plumed hat and a mocking laugh that haunted Union dreams. But as the sun climbed on May 11th, the laughter had stopped. Stuart sat his horse near an abandoned inn, listening to the thunder of 10,000 Federal hooves approaching from the north. He was tired, he was outnumbered, and perhaps for the first time, he was alone. This was the climax of a collision months in the making, born not just of tactical necessity, but of a venomous three-way feud that reached into the highest offices of the Union command. To understand the tragedy at Gettysburg, you have to look past the battle lines and into the tents of the Union High Command. Philip Sheridan, short, abrasive, and radiating a controlled violence, had arrived from the Western Theater with a singular burning hatred for the way the Army of the Potomac used its cavalry. He saw his troopers being wasted as orderlies and grooms for the infantry. His superior, George Meade, was a man of the old school, cautious, methodical, and deeply insulted by Sheridan's arrogance. Their resentment exploded after the Battle of the Wilderness. In a shouting match that nearly saw both men relieved of command, Sheridan snarled that if Meade would just get out of his way, he could go out and whip Stuart once and for all. Before we continue, please link and subscribe to our channel as a means of supporting our growing community. It's May 1864, and the Confederacy's most romanticized warrior is racing against time, his scarlet sash fluttering as he pushes exhausted horsemen northward. Jeb Stuart, the plumed knight of the South, has spent 3 years turning cavalry raids into legends. But on this spring morning, the legend is about to collide with a blunt, hard-charging Irish-American general who believes showmanship is no substitute for shock and firepower. That collision would happen at a forgotten crossroads tavern, and it would mark the beginning of the end for Confederate cavalry supremacy in the East. We have to step back into the bloody opening moves of Ulysses S. Grant's overland campaign. Grant had come east determined to fight Lee's Army of Northern Virginia relentlessly, not trading ground for victories, but grinding the Confederacy down. In the dense wilderness, Union cavalry under Philip Sheridan had struggled. They were used as scouts and flank guards, scattered and reactive, while Confederate horsemen under Stuart seemed to anticipate every move. Sheridan was furious. This compact, pugnacious fighter from Ohio had no patience for what he saw as outdated thinking. To him, cavalry wasn't just the Army's eyes. It was a hammer meant to smash the enemy's own mounted forces and create chaos deep in their rear. He clashed openly with Army of the Potomac Commander George Meade, who favored the traditional cautious approach. The argument grew so heated that Sheridan essentially told Meade his interference was crippling the cavalry. When Meade complained to Grant, the Union commander-in-chief made one of the most consequential decisions of the campaign. If Sheridan thinks he can beat Stuart, Grant said in essence, then let him go do it. On May 9th, Sheridan did exactly that. He pulled together over 10,000 troopers, artillery batteries, and a lean, fast-moving column. No massive wagon trains, no tents, minimal baggage. This was a raid designed for destruction and decisive combat. They swung southeast from Spotsylvania, aiming straight at Confederate supply lines, and ultimately, Stuart himself. The raid hit hard at Beaver Dam Station. Union troopers torched warehouses packed with food and ammunition meant for Lee's hungry army. Locomotives hissed and exploded. Rails were twisted into Sheridan neckties. Smoke rose for miles. Stuart, determined not to repeat his costly absence at Gettysburg, pursued with everything he could muster. But he was dividing limited resources while Sheridan's force stayed concentrated. Ulysses S. Grant, watching from the wings, didn't care about their egos. He cared about results. He gave Sheridan the green light. The leash was cut. Sheridan wasn't just sent to scout, he was unleashed to hunt a man. Stuart knew the hunters were coming. For years, he had been the South's indispensable eyes, but the weight of his own legend was beginning to crush him. He was still reeling from the criticism of Gettysburg, where his long absence had left Robert E. Lee blind. He couldn't afford another mistake. He couldn't afford to let Richmond fall. Before riding out to meet Sheridan, Stuart made a rare stop at a friend's house to see his wife, Flora. It was a brief, haunting goodbye. He told his aides that he didn't expect to survive the war, and worse, if the South fell, he didn't want to. The flamboyant cavalier was gone. In his place was a man who saw the end approaching and chose to ride straight toward it. By the time the two forces collided at Yellow Tavern, just 6 miles north of Richmond, the heat was stifling. Sheridan's column was a massive blue hammer, 5 miles long, equipped with the new 7-shot Spencer carbines. Stuart had managed to scrape together barely 4,500 men. He was banking on reinforcements from the Richmond defenses to strike Sheridan's flank. He waited. He held the line. He watched the horizon for the dust clouds of Southern infantry that never came. The Confederate High Command was a fractured mess of competing priorities, and Stuart, the man who had always been there to save everyone else, found himself abandoned at the crossroads. The end didn't come in a grand, sweeping charge. It came in the chaos of a counterattack. As George Armstrong Custer's Michigan Brigade smashed into the Confederate left, Stuart rode to the very front of the line, firing his personal revolver into the blue wave. In the swirling smoke, a 44-year-old Union private named John Huff, a former sharpshooter whose own horse had been shot out from under him, spotted the man with the plumed hat. Huff leveled his pistol and fired a single shot from 40 yards away. The bullet tore through Stuart's abdomen. As he was led away, his boots dragging in the dirt, he looked at his retreating men and cried out, "Go back! Do your duty as I have done mine. I would rather die than be whipped." Stuart lingered for 24 agonizing hours in a darkened room in Richmond. Outside, the bells of the Capitol tolled, and the sound of distant cannon fire signaled that the war was moving on without him. When he was told the end was near, he whispered, "I am resigned. God's will be done." He died on May 12th. When Robert E. Lee received the news, the man often described as a marble statue broke. He turned his face to the wall and said, "I can scarcely think of him without weeping." A premonition that he might not survive the war, and that if the Confederacy fell, he wouldn't want to live anyway. The dashing cavalier was showing cracks. Stuart chose his ground carefully near an abandoned inn called Yellow Tavern, just north of Richmond. The terrain favored a defender, and he hoped to stall Sheridan until reinforcements arrived from the capital. On May 11th, the two forces collided. What followed was pure chaos, made even more dramatic by an afternoon thunderstorm that turned the field into a muddy, lightning-lit nightmare. Union bugles echoed as waves of blue cavalry, mounted and dismounted, pressed forward. George Armstrong Custer's Michigan Brigade was in the thick of it, as aggressive as ever. Confederate artillery barked back, but numbers and momentum favored Sheridan. Stuart, true to form, stayed dangerously forward, directing guns and shouting encouragement. Then, in one of those strange turns history loves, a single pistol shot changed everything. Private John A. Huff, a veteran marksman from the 5th Michigan, spotted a mounted Confederate officer calmly rallying his men, and fired. The bullet struck Stuart in the side. Stuart stayed composed at first. When asked about the wound, he reportedly said, "I am afraid it is serious." Even as he was carried rearward, he urged his men to keep fighting. But the Confederate line buckled under the pressure. Sheridan's troopers overran the position, capturing guns and scattering the defenders. Richmond was tempting, just 6 miles away, and lightly defended. Many in Sheridan's command wanted to ride in and raise hell. But Sheridan, pragmatic as always, knew they couldn't hold it. Instead, he turned east, crossed the Chickahominy, and eventually linked up with other Union forces. Mission accomplished. Confederate cavalry had been mauled, their logistics crippled, and their commander mortally wounded. Stuart was taken into Richmond. Doctors knew the wound was fatal. Robert E. Lee, upon hearing the news, was visibly shaken. "Stuart has been more than a subordinate to me," he said. As church bells tolled and his favorite hymns filled the room, Jeb Stuart died on the evening of May 12th, barely a day after the battle. The death of Jeb Stuart was the death of the Confederate cavalry's soul. They would never again possess that aura of invincibility, that sense that they could ride anywhere and do anything. But the tragedy of Yellow Tavern isn't just found in the loss of a commander. It's found in the realization that Stuart was a sacrifice at the altar of command failure. He was left to die because of a Union feud that forced a battle, and a Confederate system that failed to support its most loyal servant. We often remember history as a series of grand movements, but it is more often a story of fragile egos and broken promises. Stuart died for a cause he knew was fading, killed by a man who was promoted for the kill, while the generals who started the fight lived to argue about it in their memoirs. In the end, the legend of the Cavalier was buried in the Virginia red clay, leaving us to wonder how much of history is shaped by brilliance and how much is simply the bloody debris of human resentment.